Okay, so shall we start this next session?
Yes, okay.
So, good afternoon, everybody. And it's a pleasure to welcome you on the second session of our virtual symposium, BRICS countries at 20 Prospects for Acceleration. So I'm Sofia Rekord from St. Petersburg State University of Economics, Unicon, and we have an incredible panel with speakers from all over the world. So let me briefly introduce them. Michael Buchanan, Head Portfolio Strategy and Risk Group, Macro Strategy, Temasek International Private Limited, an investment company headquartered in Singapore. Yaroslav Lisavolik, Head of the Analytical Department, Sberbank. Logan Rangasamy, Academic Director and Adjunct Professor, Wits Business School, Johannesburg, South Africa. Nice to see you. Alexander Losev, Director General, Joint Stock Company Management Company, Sputnik Capital Management. So we are waiting for one more speaker, for David Daquey Lee. We hope that we will have him also as well as a high-profile speaker on this topic. So thank you all so much for taking the time to participate in our discussion today. So we've got 1.5 hours. You're watching us around the world, so welcome to participate. So do send questions to the chat function or questions and answers. I'll get to them later if we will have time. So we have 2 languages in our session, Russian and English. And thanks to simultaneous translation, you may easily switch between them. So you're welcome. And so let me first start from Michael Buchanan. Mr. Buchanan, 2021 is the anniversary year for the BRIC acronym, which was introduced in November 2001, I guess, by Goldman Sachs Economic Research Group. So as far as I know, you personally worked with Jim O'Neill, Head of Global Economic Research at the time, developing the concept of BRIC as the group of fast-growing large emerging countries. But since the time, of course, this group has passed through the great evolution in different crises and also positive transformations, including establishing of the new development bank. So could you please describe your vision of BRIC economy's performance through time, taking into account new external challenges, need for the recovery growth, and some structural disbalances? So please, the floor is yours, Mr. Buchanan.
Yeah, spasibo. First of all, in terms of the original, vision of BRICS, and yes, absolutely, I was working very closely with Jim at the time, and we even put out something which I think is probably the corniest title I've ever used for one of my publications, which was called the BRIC Layer, which tried to sort of bring some of the ideas we had around just how fast demand for consumer products in particular would pick up in the BRICS. And I just remember, when we first started to do that work, and we were looking for growth in sort of mobile phone penetration of 40% and, within a year or two, and people just thought those numbers were ridiculous. But of course, one of the things that very clearly played out in the BRICS economies and elsewhere was the importance of thinking about demand for things like consumer durables and so on, not with a GDP mindset where, GDP might go up, whether it's 5% or 10%, and so would demand for a product. That's not the right way to think about how these economies were changing, because demand for many key products, consumer durables, and hence some of the component inputs, grow much more, as an S-curve. In other words, if you're on a dollar a day and you double your income, you don't necessarily buy a lot more washing machines, and similarly, if you're earning $1 million a year and you double your income, maybe you don't buy that many more. There's a sweet spot, and our view was then that China was right on the cusp of that, and India was about 10 to 15 years behind. And I think in general that's sort of played out. Oh, great! Now you've got my presentation up. Let me go through a couple of the kind of key, more quantitative points I wanted to emphasize. I'll try and be relatively brief, so we've got more time for Q&A. But one thing I think is very important is back when we first started to talk about BRICS, right on the left-hand side of this chart, the contribution to global growth, in this case from China specifically, was only about 30 basis points. And so really what I want you to take away from this chart is, putting aside 2020, of course, and the COVID situation, is that even as the GDP growth rate in China has fallen dramatically from a peak of 14% with the sort of stimulus in 07, down to more like 6. The contribution to global growth from China has actually gone up. And so for many things that we care about, demand for certain commodities, for the importance of China, for the impact on other emerging markets around China, it's ever more important, even though the growth rate has obviously come down very, very significantly. And I think as this has played out, it's completely changed the nature of geopolitics as well. So more countries today have China as their main trading partner than the US, and that's a big shift. And so we would expect that to continue. Growth rate coming down, but the contribution of China to global growth remaining extremely important and just as high as before. If we go to page 2, this is very obvious stuff on page 2, but clearly as all of this has played out, you've seen this shift very strongly towards investment. Are we able to go to page 2? Well, fortunately, it is a very, there we go, terrific. So investment, of course, has grown much faster than GDP, and along with that has come a decrease in the efficiency of investment. So we're measuring that here simply by the ICOR, or incremental capital output ratio. And so you can see that, which is inverted on the right-hand side, that quite significant deterioration. Now, for a country with a very high savings rate, this doesn't create in itself a systemic risk for China, in my view, but it does have an impact on trend growth, and that's incorporated in those numbers you're seeing before. Now, if we look on page 3, I think we have to address the debt issue in China. Everyone is always very obsessed about the risks from the high level of leverage in China. I've been much more relaxed about that structurally, but we have, of course, seen a sharp jump after some years of stabilization with the response to COVID. That's true absolutely everywhere, and I think actually in China, these moves are relatively manageable and do not in themselves create a systemic risk. But how this plays out as we look on page 4 is going to be quite important. And we are seeing, I think, quite a meaningful shift at the moment. So on page 4, if that can come up, what you're seeing is an adjustment in terms of where the sort of the pain is on the debt side and the default side. So until very recently, first of all, of course, there are very few defaults. That's a defining characteristic, but almost all of them were private enterprises. Whereas you're seeing a little bit of a shift towards SOE defaults, which you can see in the blue bars on the left. And so that's something that is actually a good thing, but it's something that we'll be watching quite closely just to make sure that that plays out in a smooth fashion. That would certainly be our expectation. But given what's happening with monetary policy, which I'll come back to, that will be quite an important aspect of how China manages this transition. In fact, maybe just to sort of touch on the monetary policy side of it here. Just in the most recent statements that we've had from policymakers in China, there's just a little bit of a hint towards a tightening of policy. They're focused now a little bit more on avoiding sort of building in systemic risks into the financial system, and also on kind of creating room for future monetary policy easing should that be necessary. And that just sort of sends a little bit of a signal that policy might be a touch tighter going forward. And the growth GDP growth targets look very low to us. Policymakers are talking about 6%. We would see Chinese growth in 2021 more like 8%, even if they do very little on the policy side. Now, on page 5, obviously the share of household income as a percentage of GDP has gone down, and the share of consumption remains very low in China today. But that said, you have had, as you can see in the orange bars on the left, you've had very significant compounded growth in consumption. It's just been a little bit less dramatic than the rest of the economy. And the point I would make here, and this is something I think we all need to watch carefully going forward in China, is that in the past, it was always easy to say, well, the household sector has so much room to grow, there's so little leverage. If anything goes wrong, we can just lever up the consumer. That's no longer the case. Mortgage debt and some other consumer debt has risen relatively significantly now in China. And so that room that was always there before is much less true now. On page 6, on the left-hand side, you can see the aging of the population. We all know this, I won't go through that, but clearly China is aging significantly. But then when you look at the education level for workers, I think here there's quite an interesting opportunity. This is a space that for example, we at Temasek are very focused on to invest in education sector in China, both in terms of primary, secondary education, but also sort of tertiary qualifications, retraining, and so on. There's a lot of opportunity there to continue China's build up the sort of value-added curve that we've already seen significantly. On page 7, just briefly on in terms of these SOE reforms and the sort of tighter sort of budget for SOEs. Of course, that's going to lead to an exit of non-viable firms. I won't take you through all of this given the time, but what I would focus on is right at the bottom, the kind of fiscal reforms that are going to be necessary to manage this process. There's going to need to be a greater flow of fiscal resources to some of the poorer regions, and also a shift in the nature of local government revenues towards more sustainable revenue, like property taxes, rather than very, very cyclical things like property sales, for example. So again, that's something that we believe is happening that will make the China story more sustainable and continue this quite extraordinary rise that we've seen in China. Given the time, I'll just be very, very brief on the other BRICS. So on page 8, we can see obviously since the original work, we've had very, very strong but slowing growth in India, Russia, and Brazil. On page 9, a key point I would make here is that obviously the savings rate in these other BRICS, that creates a much greater limit to the investment growth that we can expect. And particularly as the earlier commodity super cycle unwound, that limited the growth potential and also led to some currency weakness. Given the time, let me just jump to slide 12, because one good thing for actually many emerging markets, but including Brazil, India, and Russia, is that in the past, we always worried that whenever there's a bit of a risk-off event, currencies will depreciate. The pass-through from depreciation to inflation is very high. And so, central banks would be forced into a pro-cyclical tightening of monetary policy, which would be very, very difficult. That's much less true. First of all, inflation rates everywhere are low, although obviously some and others would argue that there are some risks there, but we would expect that to continue for the foreseeable future. And pass-through from depreciation has fallen pretty much everywhere. And that gives monetary policy much greater flexibility in all of these markets, and also allows the countries to use the exchange rates much more as a shock absorber, which is exactly what you want them to be able to do. And that makes, again, the sort of growth story a little more sustainable. So finally, on the last page, the external imbalances and reserve adequacy numbers have improved. That's especially true for Russia, but for many of these markets. And so overall, as we look at all of these countries, we're still very positive structurally on the BRICS. I'd say in terms of our shorter term views, I'd make a little bit of a distinction right now and say, you know, China has had a fantastic run. Policy, it dealt with the COVID situation arguably much faster, and also had very accommodating policy settings. Those settings are now just starting to be tightened a little bit, and markets have run up. So we would be a little less excited right now, but the structural story in China is still fantastic. Whereas the other emerging markets, we would still retain a tactical sort of positive on. But just one last point to close on in terms of, you know, really the big picture, longer term sort of outlook for, in particular, China. I think there's still a tendency among, you know, many people in the West to sort of think of China as being a brilliant copycat producer, and that is just absolutely not the case in so many areas. And I don't just mean in sort of you know, producing goods, but in terms of life sciences, for example. There really is some amazing innovation going on in China, and that's a space that we love, and I think is testament to the shift in, you know, the nature of the growth story in China, very much moving up the value-added curve. So let me leave it there, and we can cover more stuff in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Buchanan, for this very detailed view of the structural features of BRIC countries in its evolution. And we see this combination of external uncertainties and shocks, and this need for some reforms, structural reforms for either developed or developing countries anyway. And BRICS economies are also in this playground, so to say. So I see that Professor Lee has joined us. Yes, could you please say something?
Yes, I am here. Yes, I'm here. Yes.
Very good, very good, very nice. So if you don't mind, the next question will be to you, Professor Lee. Okay, so I would love to turn to the issue of the main authority, actually, of BRIC countries, which actually makes this group a real institution. So it institutionalizes the group of BRICS. So in this new development bank. So could you comment on the activities of the new development bank and how you see maybe the prospects of the development of joint investment projects, maybe infrastructural projects between the BRICS countries? Given that this factor is a great indicator of economic cooperation within the group, and maybe could you describe these prospects of joint investment activities within the new development bank in general, if you don't mind?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me here. Thank you, and thank Mark Wuzan, my longtime friend, for inviting me. And here we're discussing a very important topic, the BRICS and 20 years. And among the initiatives of the BRICS countries, the New Development Bank definitely is one of the outstanding new initiatives. And it's been running for almost over 5 years now. By now, over 5 years, and the NDB has made a few progress in the following areas. Number one, the NDB has been having the fastest pace of investment among new multinational development agencies, and is actually running at a faster pace than another institution which was set up at the same time, which is the ARIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The NDB is running faster than that. And also the NDB has been, I would argue, that more innovative than all the peer institutions set up around about 5 years ago. I myself, I worked at the NDB as the chief economist until last May, and so I witnessed the innovation. Okay, so what are the innovations the NDB has been doing? The first one is to do local currency lending. Okay, so a certain degree, a certain proportion of the loans were made in local currency. That is, for example, to do Russian projects in Russian ruble, in the Indian projects in Indian rupee. Why this is important? This is important. Number one is to greatly mitigate the exchange rate risks of the borrowing countries. And because until now, almost all international agencies have been lending out in the US dollar, okay? So imposing foreign exchange risk upon borrowing countries. And also, this is also important because the other side of the lending is the borrowing of the NDB. The NDB has been issuing debt in local currencies. For example, issuing debt in China in RMB. Okay, so this is able to help NDB to diversify its source of funding. Okay, so this is super important. And another innovation the NDB has been doing is called the low country practice. That is to impose an overall standard of projects. However, it does not impose very specific things on the project. So I use the metaphor of gymnastics. You know, in gymnastics, you have required programs, you have your freestyle programs. So so far in almost all international, like the World Bank, all of their lending are like required programs. Like in gymnastics, right? You are required to perform certain moves. Okay, individual players does not have the room to do their own maneuver. Okay, but with NDB encourages individual countries to have a certain degree of freedom to do their own projects. For example, very specific, the procurement standard. So let me give a hypothetical example. If Russia has a program in, for example, subway construction, borrowing money from the New Development Bank. Okay, now in the old practice, Russia has to follow the standard of procurement of the steel, of construction material, according to a very rigid standard, which is extremely burdensome, also very costly. But NDB says that, well, Russia can do your own procurement procedure so long as you follow 1, 2, 3 principles, like clean, transparent, and like anti-corruption, so on and so forth. So this greatly enhanced the efficiency of lending. And another thing the NDB has been doing, okay, I wouldn't say it has achieved major progress yet, but it's definitely making good progress. That is, the NDB has been pushing for its own research agenda. Okay? The NDB has a very important function in producing policy proposals, in publishing reports. Until now, the World Bank's, the international monetary funds, have been publishing very influential reports, and these reports mostly reflect perspectives of major Western countries, like the US, okay, lacking the perspectives of emerging market economies. But NDB has been publishing its own reports reflecting the perspectives and also the standards and also the policy thinking of BRICS countries. This is extremely important. Now, next step. Let me finish with after this one. Okay. Next step is NDB is now expanding its membership. Why expanding membership? Because the NDB wants its members to be diversified, not only from the BRICS countries, but also countries from other regions, in order to stabilize the funding, okay, the stabilized portfolio, the diversified portfolio, to make sure the financing is more stable. Also, this way, the NDB is more inclusive is more diversified in its policy perspectives. So let me end here. In summary, I strongly believe, as a former employer of the NDB, I strongly believe NDB is one of the highlights of the BRICS collaboration. Okay, every year BRICS leaders come together, and the NDB the president of NDB makes report to the 5 countries leaders. Okay, so I am very enthusiastic with NDB, even though I'm no longer working for the NDB. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. So you paid attention to the role of NDB in de-dollarization, so to say, and this diversification of currency flows. So it's a kind of a anti-crisis role, so to say, of the mechanism of NDB as well. So this diversification, and also I noticed this innovative role of NDB as well. Could you just answer some small additional question from me? Because I'm very much interested in whether bank still develops joint investment projects in its portfolio. I guess it's the crucial criterion of the development bank as it is. So not just financing projects of each country separately, but joint initiatives or joint projects. Do you examine that development of this kind of projects within the NDB portfolio? What would you say?
Yes, my understanding is the NDB is working very hard exploring this kind of projects. And notice that the NDB, number one, does have the intention to enhance more collaboration across countries, especially across member countries. And number two, because of the so-called country standard rather than international standard, these would allow more cross-country collaborations. When I left NDB, the NDB was doing research on issues like collaboration between NDB and the sovereign countries' development banks. For example, in Russia, you have your own state development bank, right? And NDB would jointly work with them. So yes, indeed, the NDB is working on that, and I am hopeful, and also I'm confident NDB will have collaborative projects across countries before long.
Switched on the microphone. Thank you very much, Professor Lee, for your input. And I'd love to give the floor to Mr. Lisa Volik. And my question is, as far as we know, in 2020, Russia chaired BRICS, and also a new strategy of economic development was also adopted. So given this multiple uncertainties of the modern world economy and this this monocurrency in the world, still do you see some anti-crisis role of BRICS countries nowadays? So how do you see this? Could you please comment?
Yes, thank you very much, Sophia, and thank you very much for this opportunity to present to you my views on this subject. I think the anti-crisis role is precisely what needs to be at the center of discussions in the coming year and possibly even further, because this is an unprecedented crisis that calls for a very concerted response from the largest developing economies, from the BRICS economies. And in discussing this anti-crisis response, I think one theme that is, in my view, very important to note is that as BRICS turn 20, I think they're grown up enough to try to deliver an anti-crisis response that is not just confined to themselves. Instead of being introverts, they need to become extroverts in a significant way, and to look at the possibility of delivering growth impulses, anti-crisis responses beyond the BRICS perimeter to a wider range of countries. And this in turn is possible, I think, because there are mechanisms, there are institutions that allow for such a transmission mechanism to take place from the BRICS economies to other developing countries, most notably with respect to their regional partners. Every BRICS economy is a central pillar within a certain region of the developing world, whether it's Russia and the Eurasian region, whether it's Brazil and Latin America, South Africa and Africa, etc. And there are regional integration arrangements, there are regional development banks, there are regional financing arrangements already in existence where BRICS countries are members, and these institutions, these instruments can be used in order to deliver this growth impulse, these anti-crisis impulses coming from the BRICS economies to their regional partners. And I think this vision of how the anti-crisis measures of the BRICS economies can redound to the global economy. It can be taken to yet a higher level, to a global level of sorts. I think what the BRICS countries can look at is the possibility of combining their regional integration arrangements, their regional development institutions, and their regional financing arrangements into platforms that can target certain key priorities, anti-crisis priorities for the developing world and the global economy more generally. So if we're talking about trade, then the respective regional trade arrangements where BRICS countries are members can cooperate together with the World Trade Organization in matters that have to do with reducing trade barriers, including with respect to critical items such as medicine, medical equipment, etc. If we're talking about connectivity, if we're talking about infrastructure, then it's about the platform of the regional development banks where BRICS countries are members, where they can cooperate. And NDB, the new development bank, can play a coordinating role. And of course, the World Bank at the global level can play a coordinating role there in promoting this cooperation amongst regional development banks. And building portfolios, anti-crisis portfolios of the respective projects. And then, of course, we're talking about the macroeconomic stabilization mechanisms. And in this regard, the respective regional financing arrangements where BRICS countries are members can play a role, and they can cooperate in that regard with the BRICS CRA and with the International Monetary Fund. In fact, some of these platforms are already in existence. The World Bank has created a platform for regional development banks to look into issues of cooperation in matters such as migration. And the IMF for several years now has been conducting regular coordination activities with the respective RFAs, regional financing arrangements, that target themes such as monitoring the state of the regional economy, the state of the global economy, and cooperation between regional institutions and global institutions such as the IMF. Then there's, of course, on top of all of these issues that I've just mentioned, the regional, the global, another aspect to the global agenda is the G20, where BRICS countries, of course, all BRICS countries are members, and this is a very important forum where key priorities of anti-crisis policies are being discussed. And of course, there is a role for the BRICS to have more of a coordination in these discussions. Probably there may be a need to speak with more of a unified voice on issues such as the needs of the least developed economies. This is something that I think still needs probably further joint work. And of course, another theme that has to do with anti-crisis response coming from the BRICS is what my Chinese colleague has also already mentioned, the issue of the expansion of the new development bank and accordingly the delivery of these growth impulses and the implementation of projects across a wider range of developing economies. I think it's only natural for the new members to be selected from amongst the regional partners of the respective BRICS countries in order to facilitate the connectivity projects that may be then financed through NDB loans. Generally, I think when we're talking about the anti-crisis response, there needs to be more of a coordination for BRICS economies, not just amongst themselves, but also with their respective regional partners and the respective regional institutions. This is a tremendous resource that so far is underutilized, severely underutilized in the global economy. Suffice it to say that the resources of the respective regional development banks are larger than those of the World Bank, and those of the regional financing arrangements rival that of the resources of the IMF. So this is something to look into, particularly as in the past several years, the BRICS has been looking into the possibility of strengthening this cooperation with the respective regional institutions in which BRICS countries are members. Now, another theme that I think is very important is the positioning of BRICS in the post-COVID world. I think certainly reforming global governance, reforming global institutions, and most notably, the reform of the WTO is a key issue here. I think one of the things that the BRICS can do, and I'm surprised they haven't done this so far, is to create a unified bloc within the WTO, because after Russia joined the WTO, all countries, all BRICS economies are part of the WTO. They can create a bloc that pursues key trade priorities in the global economy. Another theme is the positioning that has to do with greater inclusivity and greater openness of the BRICS. And I think in this regard, the pursuit of the BRICS Plus format that was launched by China back in 2017 is very promising and should be most likely actively pursued by China next year when it assumes yet again the presidency within BRICS. And then I think it's also about a different model for economic development, something that has been mentioned by the previous speakers in the previous panel, namely a model of economic development that is more geared towards human capital development, most notably healthcare and education, something that incorporates, a model that incorporates to a greater degree environmental standards, sustainability considerations, and ESG standards. And of course, another theme is related to that, related to this different model for economic development, is more balanced growth, lower inequality. The BRICS economies are currently, and for quite some time, have been amongst the countries with some of the highest levels of economic inequality, not just in terms of income, but in terms of cross-regional, intra-country cross-regional differences. And I think to conclude, the BRICS need to deliver something more proactive. I think they shouldn't wait for the developed world or for the global institutions to deliver their own vision, to deliver their own panacea. And I think coming up with proactive solutions like, for example, an anti-crisis policy framework. In case there's another wave of crisis, how do we respond? How does this coordination take place across BRICS countries and also in terms of the cooperation with regional partners? This is something that needs to be given significant consideration. And then there's, of course, also the need for greater innovation. Something that Mr. Buchanan talked about when he concluded his speech on China. I think we're starting to see more of that there's less imitation, more innovation, and this has to be, I think, the cornerstone of the new institutions such as the new development bank and the new policies and new approaches coming from the BRICS. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Lezhevolik. So you've created really anti-crisis agent for BRICS countries now. So of course we're living in, so to say, multifaceted world. So it's some kind of a network of networks. So as far as I understood, what you suggest is BRICS plus open formats, yes, and some hybrid systems for development, not to be so narrow-minded when we create just one format and they often compete with each other. So I think it's a very positive way of development nowadays. So we've discussed some stabilization mechanisms within BRICS, including NDB, but we have one more very important mechanism that shows that BRICS is rather mature structure and also that countries are developing their coordination also in financial and monetary sphere. So I'd love to turn to Professor Anguzami. So let me ask you a question, given your previous expertise in South African Reserve Bank. So it can be argued that during the period of its development, the BRICS group has shown significant progress in overall coordination and coordination of interaction, including such mechanism as a pool of conventional currency reserves. We cannot forget about that. So how do you assess the sense and the role of this contingency reserve arrangement in the financial coordination within BRICS and as a message for the international financial system? Because of course, we read many analysts that argue that this step may show the intention to create an alternative to the two institutions of the Bretton Woods system, the IMF and the World Bank, the effectiveness of which is increasingly now more or less in doubt. So what is your opinion about that?
Yeah, no, thank you, Sophia. I really appreciate the kind introduction and welcome. A very good afternoon from sunny South Africa. It's just past 12 a.m., 12:44 to be more precise. It's an extremely warm day here in South Africa. Temperatures around 30 degrees Celsius. I thought I'll just throw that in for our European colleagues like Mark, etc., who's wearing all these warm clothes. However, having said that, apart from the weather, we've got our fair share of problems here. Growth is low, unemployment, etc. And as you may have heard, that South Africa is currently in the news as far as the vaccines are concerned. We've procured 1 million doses. It's landed in the country, and we've just found out that the doses we've procured is going to be ineffective in terms of the new strain we have here. So we still have a lot more work to do in terms of tackling the pandemic. Let me start off by expressing my gratitude to the organizers for the invite to the symposium. I want to further state how honored and privileged I am to be part of this distinguished panel. Now, just a few introductory remarks, which covers some of the issues and topics that we have addressed earlier on. On the 27th of November 2011, the Financial Times published an article entitled, "It's Time to Bid Farewell to the BRICS." Now, the author was Philip Stevens, who argued that the BRICS grouping was heterogeneous, right, with economic, political, and other considerations making these countries what he termed uncomfortable bedfellows. Some 1.5 years later, to be more precise, on the 27th of March 2013, the BRICS leaders announced plans to establish the new development bank and the contingent reserve arrangements, the CRA, as it is more commonly known in BRICS circles. Now, according to the leaders' statement that they issued in 2013, the new development bank was meant to mobilize resources for infrastructure and sustainable development projects in BRICS and other emerging and developing countries. And it was also meant to complement the efforts of the multilateral and regional financial institutions in support of global growth and development. The CRA, or the contingent reserve arrangements, on the other hand, was meant to assist in addressing short-term balance of payments pressures in BRICS countries. However, there probably still is, much skepticism about the BRICS as a grouping. According to, on 3rd April 2013, a Harvard professor, Joseph Nair, wrote in an article that he entitled BRICS Without Mortar. So this is 1 month after the leaders issued the statement about the new development bank and the CRA. So Professor Nair, wrote this article entitled BRICS Without Mortar. This article was published in Project Syndicate. His arguments were very similar to what were expressed in the Financial Times article some 2 years ago. So according to Professor Nair, BRICS grouping was best suited to coordinating what he termed diplomatic tactics, rather than serving any meaningful purpose to advance the group as an economic powerhouse on the global stage. Now, fast forward some 6 years later to currently where we stand, the new development bank and the CRA have been established and have become operational. These two initiatives are often cited as the success stories of the BRICS, and particularly in BRICS circles themselves. The new development bank, we've already had David, speak about that. So I'm now going to concentrate and move on to look at, the issue of the CRA. But before I look at that, the issue of whether the BRICS has been successful or not, right, depends on the counterfactual. Many critics have cited that the BRICS grouping was and is not optimal. There have been arguments that other emerging economies like Mexico, South Korea, etc., should have been included in the group. However, it is very difficult to say whether such a group consisting of these additional members would have been more successful. So while the question, and this is the point that I want to make, while the question of the composition of the BRICS group is interesting, the usefulness of this question beyond academic analysis, I think, is somewhat doubtful. Rather, it is more fruitful to consider the achievements of the BRICS today than to debate whether the group's composition is appropriate or not. Despite the tensions that currently prevail, and there are many within the group, political and otherwise, there is no indication that the political will to maintain the BRICS as a group is waning. Now, this does not mean that the BRICS collaboration and cooperation to date has been optimal. In fairness, the answer is probably not. It hasn't been optimal. In fact, there are instances where differences of opinions among the BRICS members have prevented them from speaking with a united voice in international fora. And Yaroslav, made mention of this as a shortcoming, that, we don't see the BRICS speaking as a united voice in some of these international forums, G20, IMF, WTO, probably to the extent that they should. Right. And if you want me to cite a couple of examples, I think as far as differences are concerned, the IMF quota reform issue is probably a classic example of where BRICS countries have different opinions on the way forward. However, having said that, there is definitely room for more enhanced collaboration amongst members of the groups, particularly on issues of mutual benefit, such as intra-BRICS trade, capital flows, etc., etc. However, as mentioned earlier, CRA is often cited as one of the success stories of the BRICS. This initiative features quite prominently in statements released at the annual BRICS Leaders Summit. So let me now move on to look at the BRICS Contingent Reserve Arrangement more specifically, and that's a question, Sophia, you posed to me. The BRICS CRA, or the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, provides financial support through liquidity and precautionary instruments to address actual or potential short-term balance of payments pressures in BRICS country. It's a $100 billion facility and became effective in 2015. Let me provide 4 points in my assessment of the CRA. Firstly, the facility offers protection or insurance against global liquidity pressures, mainly dollar pressure. It is a facility that offers short-term assistance during periods of financial stress. Now, having an insurance or an insurance mechanism that offers financial assistance during periods of stress is something that policymakers around the world will welcome as part of the toolkit. This certainly holds true for the BRICS as far as it pertains to the CRA. Secondly, the CRA forms a vital part of the global financial safety net for the BRICS countries. As is well known, the global financial safety net has been described as patchy, uneven, unequal, and this is certainly the case for some of the BRICS countries. For example, South Africa's capital contribution under the CRA or to the CRA is $5 billion US dollars. But South Africa has access to a potential $10 billion under the facility. Now, this $10 billion is quite significant when you consider that South Africa's reserves amount to only approximately $50 billion. So it's almost 20% of our reserves. In fact, if you look at the CRA makes up 13% of the global financial safety net for South Africa. And if you exclude the reserves, and the global financial safety net as reserves, bilateral swap lines, regional financing arrangements, and IMF facility, if you take out reserves, the CRA accounts for 43% of South Africa's GFSN. So that's quite significant. However, it is not clear to what extent a country's access to the GFSN is taken into account when the IMF, does its adequacy of reserve, assessment for the country. Now, this is an important issue as it has significant implications, and this is something that we argued in South Africa. You should be taking account of these things, simply because the amount of reserves a country holds affects investor perceptions, as implications for exchange rate movements, etc., as everyone knows. Now, this issue that I've just highlighted here is an important issue for a country like South Africa, which is a small open economy and is significantly constrained in its ability to accumulate additional reserves. So what we've been arguing for in South Africa here is, rather than go for accumulating reserves, what we should be doing is looking at the other layers of the GFSN, because it's much more cheaper to have, and we can access those resources whenever we have problems and difficulty. And the CRA is basically one such facility that allows for this. The third point that I'd like to make, Sophia, relates to the operationality of the facility. The CRA features quite prominently on the work program of the BRICS central banks. Every year, a test run is undertaken to improve the operations of the facility. However, having said that, to date, only the de-linked portion of the scheme has been tested. The linked portion of the facility, which is tied to an IMF program, incidentally, makes up 70% of the facility. But this portion has not been tested. So what you have here, in effect, is a facility, right, that only makes available 30% of the funds currently, right? So there is some room to go as far as ensuring that the full 100 billion is available. Now, this is something that lies on the agenda of the central banks, and they're working towards this. And in fact, even with the IMF, there has been moves to for the IMF to enhance its cooperations with the RFAs, The CRA is very much part of that process. Fourthly, as far as the CRA is concerned, closer collaboration or cooperation between the CRA and other RFAs, particularly the Shanghai Initiative, I think is something that should be actively and aggressively explored. This would not only enhance South-South cooperation and collaboration, but would also be very beneficial for the CRA, particularly in terms of the availability of funds, and it could also assist the CRA in terms of improving the operations of the facility. And Sophia, let me move on to the second question, that you raised. Basically, the issue related to whether this is an alternative to the two institutions of the Bretton Woods system and the IMF and the World Bank, and make some comments about the effectiveness, of these IFIs. Once again, let me make 4 points and try and be a little bit more focused and direct in addressing this question. The first one relates to governance issues. There is little doubt that governance issues at the international financial institutions have become a hindrance to the execution of quick and adequate responses to strains in the global financial system. The quota-based system of the IFIs in particular is something that is quite well known and is an issue that warrants particular attention. In a world where emerging market economies account for over 40% of world GDP at market rates and almost 2/3, if not higher, of world growth currently, it is to the detriment of the world economy, not to the emerging economies alone, but to the world economy, if the voice and needs of emerging markets economies and developing economies are ignored or not adequately catered for. If we continue in the route that we are moving, we're going to end up eventually in a polarized world. And that, I think, is something that we need to address quite aggressively, in the international forum. Secondly, the potential benefits to be derived by improving cooperation and collaboration among the IFIs, including the institutions other than the World Bank and the IMF that you've highlighted there, Sophia, is without question. Enhanced collaboration would certainly result in economies of scale and scope. The issue of enhancing cooperation and collaboration is something that has been and continues to feature on the agenda as far as international fora is concerned. I was involved, in these international fora for the past 6-7 years, and it's been on the international fora for those 6 or 7 years. And I think the progress has been pretty slow in many respects. This feature also, this issue also featured quite prominently, by the way, in the report of the G20 Eminent Persons Group on global financial governance. This is something that we need to address, quite urgently and forcefully. The third point, colleagues, regional financing agreements and other regional arrangements are in fact a result of the shortcomings of the workings of the IFIs and the international financial architecture. I think in many respects, what you have, evolving over time has been a direct result of the shortcomings, of the IFIs in addressing specific needs, particularly as they pertain to emerging and developing countries. I do not think that the the regional financing arrangements were meant to create, as you put it, an alternative to the two institutions of the Bretton Woods system. Rather, the CRA, for argument's sake, was meant to address more specifically some of the shortcomings in the prevailing international financial architecture. Finally, this is a point that I'd like to leave you with. It's quite interesting to note that the CRA resembles the IMF's quota-based voting for operational decisions. However, having said that, the CRA gives BRICS members a greater say when compared to IMF processes, in the sense that no single party, has a veto position. This is definitely a step, in the right direction. Of greater concern, however, having said that, is that the IMF-linked portion of the CRA relates to the IMF-linked portion of the CRA. What this in effect means, as I pointed out earlier, is that 70% of the CRA funds is tied to IMF processes or an IMF fund. This somewhat undermines the CRA's significance. Improving its surveillance capacity, and I think also giving some attention to its legal status, will enhance the benefits of the CRA. And I think this is an issue that the BRICS stakeholders should actively engage in. Thank you, Sophia. Let me leave it there.
Thank you so much, Professor Rangasamy, because you've touched not only this particular issue that I asked you, but also the whole picture of positioning of BRICS in the world. And one of the core questions, whether it's just a group of economies, emerging economies, that it was announced 20 years ago, or it's just some kind of already some grouping that is coordinating its efforts and also developing, and how to recapitalize this format, actually, how to make it more and more productive. So maybe my finalizing question will be, in this case, to Alexander Losiev, and now I'll switch into Russian, if you do not mind. Alexander Vячеславович, учитывая вот такое взаимосвязанность...
Alexander, considering the interconnection of economic subjects of global economy and the growing speed of data transfer and the transmission of the recession signs in the world, what do you think about BRICS economies regarding financial stabilization due to development of new technologies and new trends in international finance system? Dear Sophia, dear colleagues, thanks for the invitation to speak at this symposium. And before I touch upon the BRICS countries' issues, let's try to understand the main problem of the modern world. That is the distribution of funds and capital flows in the world is determined by the behavior of US dollar is dominating, makes all the markets, global and regional, dependent on the modification of the monetary policy of the United States, whether it's IFRS or the government of the United States. You could say what happened in the year 2008, what happened last year, and all the crises and all the shocks of the Wall Street cause the modification of production of goods and services in real economy of all the global countries. Dollar domination is the main reason of disbalance in the world. The existing model of a global economy, which is dollar-oriented, dollar-centered, is wrong. For the United States to not dollars, while the trade balance saldo is negative, and they return it back via the capital market. If the US begin to struggle with that negative trade balance and trade wars and tariff wars and protectionism are used to, hence this is bad for the global trade and for the development of the rest of the world. It's bad for the developing economies first of all. On top of that, over 1/3 of debts outside the US are nominated in US dollars. We see that the world is trying to get away from the condition of recession. The world needs new sources, the new means to have the investment source to get the economies out of a recession. Yes, the world will either have to keep servicing the dollar debts or to replace dollars with own currencies.
Объемы помощи в прошлом году составили $14 триллионов.
That a huge dollar emission, according to IMF data, the assistance volume was $14 million. That's huge dollar inflation and the risks of the currency wars. We see that a crisis caused the slowdown of global trade, and it drops the prices for raw materials. We see how deficit of dollars for external markets caused problems last spring, and hence that we need to modify such a system. Moreover, we are concerned about the sanctions of the United States. So they're using their own legislation as a kind of arms of weapons, and this is bad for the global economy and for the development of many regions. We now entered a new decade. It may turn out to be a chaos. We may have many unpleasant surprises unless we clarify the situation. We see that the global economy is moving from the overall globalization towards the structure of bigger spaces. And perhaps in the new decade, the rules shall be determined by the leading regional states, not the US only, but the big countries of the region, including the BRICS countries. The BRICS countries, not to be scared of economic crisis and sanctions, secondary sanctions on behalf of US as well, to ensure the growth of the economy's concentration of capitals, resources, production capacities, shall have to support formal or informal trade and economic unions and to use own currencies for mutual payments. Otherwise, the global economy should expect a lengthy stagnation, perhaps growth, different kinds of decline into the global financial crisis that may be caused by a debt crisis. The volume of debts in the world is now at the mark of $280 trillion. It's a lot. It's not by chance that the World Bank and IMF and the City Group are warning that such huge accumulation of debts always cause financial crisis. We expect that the crisis shall impact all the countries of the world. Hence, common sense prompts us that we should create international payment systems, make stronger our own economy, and improve the developing countries. We should support the development of digital technology as well. Russia, China, and EU are creating their own interactive payment systems, and we are quite happy about the striving of China to become the global leader in the field of finance technologies. The Central Bank of China is now developing the digital RMB. Perhaps it's going to be used for international payments. That will be a great example to follow for Russia as well. The Central Bank of Russia is having plans of a digital ruble, and other BRICS countries could follow this example as well. Digital currencies and new technologies may promote the country's economic and technical achievements. So far, we see that the payments between the BRICS countries are made in dollars so far. And even China, with its huge project, One Way, One Belt, we see that this huge project is both the economic and political project. Even in that project, only 2% of payments are made in RMB. The rest is done in dollars. Though China makes 1/5 of the global GDP, but they still don't make payments in RMB so much, mainly in dollars. So both China and Russia and other BRICS countries should create new credit money. Because dollars may be limited, sanctions and legislation may be used as weapons, and they may modify the payment flows. And both digital currencies are necessary, and we should have a mechanism of payments with the currencies of BRICS countries, whether it's rupee, ruble, or RMB. So a new multi-currency system should be created so that the BRICS countries are more resistant to the global shocks. Well, the role of the regional payment system in the next decade shall be determining a role. And it will determine whether the regions and countries shall be able to resist the possible negative impacts caused with asymmetry of the global financing systems and the accumulated disbalance. We also do understand that neither the financing nor economy development is possible in the third decade of this century without technologies development. The main productive force of modern economy becomes information, human potential, and technology. So the world shall be subdivided into the countries and the ones who are dragging behind. And if they drag behind, that's forever. So the objectives of the BRICS countries should be a less formal union. We should remain vital organization, and we should be able to coordinate our efforts and to cooperate so that in our countries there continues the scientific and technical and industrial development. See that the division of the world into the technological metropolis and a technological province or periphery is going into the past. Not the US only has the technologies. High technologies are available: space, energy, digital information, AI, and financial technologies exist as well. Communications sector, biotechnologies. Each of the BRICS countries does possess some of these technologies and has certain improvements in at least one of such fields. So we should unite our efforts in this regard and create big regional projects like the One Way, One Belt initiative, like the involvement of Russia, India, and Brazil into a competition in the field of aerospace technologies, the competition with the United States. We should also create the payment system that will be able to replace dollar or work parallel with dollar. Hence, we'll be able to create our own investment resources in all the global regions. That's what the world is expecting from the countries which are nowadays called developing countries, but in future they will become the basis of the global economic growth. Like nowadays, the global economic growth depends on the success of China and India. I believe in future that will regard all the BRICS countries. A lot will depend on how we develop our finance sector and the digital technologies. Thank you very much, Alexander Vячеславович, for a very detailed explanation.
That I was thinking while our speakers were talking. So we have very different economies within BRICS grouping. So some currencies are based on commodities, others are based on finished goods. So more or less, it's not so easy to coordinate this financial issue. But on the other hand, by the way, we are all high-tech countries. This is really true. So I think that it's a really important point to recapitalize our high-tech cooperation within the group. But anyway, of course, it depends from this common will, consolidation. So how countries are eager to cooperate, to consolidate their efforts. So this is a crucial point, actually. So, by the way, we have one question from the audience, but it is very close to what was already mentioned. So it was asked, could you please determine the intrinsic tenets of the innovation management to organize a cross-sectoral interaction of the productive forces in different territories of the BRICS countries? So we are speaking about cross-sectoral cooperation, I guess, in the productive forces. If the speakers and guests, they have any comments, so please welcome. Can you comment something on a cross-sectoral cooperation within BRICS? Hello?
Perhaps one theme that I would note here is, if we're talking about, from what I understand, the organizational arrangements that would facilitate the cross-sectoral cooperation amongst BRICS countries, I think the role of the new development bank is absolutely crucial in promoting what can be denoted as integration projects, so to say. Such a term has been used across the development banks to denote cooperation amongst various countries that are members of the bank to come up with, goods and services where a host of countries is making its contribution. And so accordingly, I think when we look at ways of facilitating this cross-sectoral cooperation across BRICS countries, NDB and its cooperation with the respective regional banks where BRICS countries are members would be absolutely crucial in building a portfolio of projects that can advance projects that have to do with building BRICS value-added chains, regional value-added chains, and that can make use of the complementarities that are intrinsic in the economic nature of the BRICS economies. Indeed, as has been mentioned, the economic foundations, the sectoral foundations of the BRICS economies differ in many ways, and there's significant scope for these complementarities to be exploited. I think if we're talking about specific sectors, I would encourage the development institutions such as the regional development banks and the new development bank to take a closer look at high-tech sectors, computer technology, medical equipment, nanotechnology, etc. I think there is scope for building greater cooperation across BRICS countries. And again, I think one of the themes that needs to be explored to a greater degree is ways of building BRICS value-added chains.
Thank you very much. I guess, or I noted that Mr. Rangasamy wanted to add something. Yes or no?
Yeah, no, sure. Just very quickly, I thought Yaroslav, raised some important issues. The other one, probably relates to cross-border trade. I think currently there's still a lot of trade, priced in US dollars. I think that's another project, that the BRICS country could actually pursue, trying to see whether we can't trade, in domestic currencies. Having said that, I at least from where I sit now, I'm not certain, how much of collaboration and cooperation or engagements have happened around, the current COVID-19 pandemic, whether there could be better collaboration, in terms of addressing, the pandemic. At least from where I sit, I think, more could have been done. And, what the constraints were, it's difficult to say. But I think they are, while there's tensions, and this was the point I was trying to make, in my presentation there, is that while there are tensions, on some issues, there are areas where I think there are significant mutual benefits that can be derived, and more needs to be done in terms of identifying them and actively pursuing those. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I see one more question in the chat. What resources of intensive economic growth can we determine in the area of BRICS? Intensive economic growth. Partly, again, we discussed that, but maybe some details could follow.
Well, maybe I'll say a couple of words on this. My conviction is that there are tremendous resources for the BRICS economies to exploit in mutual cooperation and in using mutual cooperation to achieve higher growth rates. And I think one of the themes that is becoming more and more important in the past several years in this regard is the issue of connectivity. All of the countries across BRICS, they are large economies with significant needs for connectivity within these countries. There are significant constraints that are faced by economies such as Russia, for example, for internal mobility, for labor mobility, and connectivity in that regard is absolutely crucial. So again, this serves to show the significant role for NDB, for development institutions in advancing these projects, the connectivity projects that would in activate one of the most important forces of economic growth for the BRICS economies, which in turn is productivity. If you have greater connectivity, if you have greater intensity of interaction and cooperation across regions within BRICS economies, then the conditions for greater productivity growth, of course, are better. And then another theme, I think, is of course the services sector. In the services sector, I think there are very important segments of demand that are still to be satiated, that are still to be addressed. One of the basic ones is housing. If there's a way, again, through the development mechanisms to boost some of the most significant needs across BRICS, such as housing, such as education, such as healthcare, basically themes that have to do with human capital development, this is a tremendous boost to economic growth in these countries.
It's Mike. If that's the only thing I'd add to that is just given I'm a little more skeptical overall, I guess, about the coordination of policies amongst the BRICS. But I think, in terms of NDB, AIIB, and just other uses of sort of Chinese the sort of infrastructure companies, I think there's some lessons that are being learned, and that process is now, I think, more likely to deliver productivity enhancing sustainable projects for those countries that accept the money from those various institutions. And so I think that all goes well. And of course, the BRICS and again, particularly China, are well placed to provide the resources, not just financial resources, but the physical resources, the companies and so on, that can really help on the infrastructure side. But I think it's interesting when you look at some of the projects that, it hasn't just been sort of China. You have seen cooperation, Indian companies bidding on and successfully bidding to be involved in some of these projects as well. And so there, I think there's quite a lot of scope for cooperation. But, related to sort of that and one of the other questions I saw on the chat, I mean, the thing that I would come back to, which I sort of mentioned at the end of my earlier remarks, is just to make sure everyone is really thinking of these economies in an up-to-date way. They really are delivering very high value added. They've moved dramatically up the value added curve, and it's not the same sort of conversations that we were having back in the early 2000s about what would be necessary in terms of cooperation and so on to get these countries up. And you really do have truly world-class innovation happening in the BRICS, and so I think that's fantastic. But it also probably changes the nature of the conversation a little bit from what we used to have. Thank you.
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Mr. Buchanan, for your input. So we are finishing now. We have to finalize. And during these days, we'll also touch different issues of maybe today's talk. Also, digital money will be discussed tomorrow. And also today, we will discuss this Eurasian integration, also regional aspect. But anyway, which seems to be very important is that, of course, this BRICS format needs to be recapitalized, so to say, from the point of view of cross-regional value chains, alternative financial mechanisms, some alternative cross-regional mechanisms of governance. And so anyway, it's a unique, so to say, cross-continental grouping, we may say so. And of course, it needs to be developed to become more mature from the point of view of the coordination mechanism. So I think we have to finish on that. Let me thank you all for this great discussion. And it was really great to link up from different countries, different continents even. And let's hope we can meet personally in some time in future. So thank you very much for your participating, and see you on the next sessions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So next session, 2 p.m. Thank you. See you shortly. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Logan. Hope to see you. Also, Mark, thank you so much. Great.